somewhat horrifying, but okay. I will continue on and spend most of my time. Should I start again? No, I'm just kidding. So he doesn't decisively sort of choose between the two remaining viable regime types, arguing it's a practical decision left up to the historical circumstances and traditions of thought and practice of particular societies. But he does argue that the theory of justice itself can help provide, quote, guidelines for how the decision between socioeconomic regimes can, quote, be reasonably approached. Using these guidelines, Edmondson, in his quite remarkable book titled John Rawls' Reticent Socialist, builds on Rawls's application of his theory of justice as a metric for regime evaluation. And unlike Rawls, concludes that justice as fairness is in fact decisive on the question of regime type compatibility. Upon its application, Edmondson concludes, quote, liberal socialism emerges as the sole regime type capable of realizing justice as fairness. So my paper engages with Edmondson's interpretation of the institutional requirements of Rawls's theory of justice, but it does so in a somewhat of a modified manner. I bracket off the idea of property owning democracy, and in its place, I retrieve and reconstruct a modified ideal of the welfare state, and I retrieve that from the ideal type bin into which Rawls unceremoniously swept the welfare state into. So I'm just picking it out of the bin here. This modification, that is swapping out the idea of a property-owning democracy and instead, for the purpose of analysis, reintroducing a modified version of the welfare state, is motivated by two main considerations. The first is that Rawls's account of the welfare state itself is a rather incomplete ideal reconstruction of actual welfare state practice. It proceeds largely along means-tested poverty relief lines and unduly omits many of the advanced social democratic policies and entitlements that developed in the wider world of welfare states outside of the US. And second, insofar as one of Rawls's tests for the practical decision regarding regime types is, as mentioned, compatibility with a society's historical circumstances and traditions, property-owning democracy is at an inherent disadvantage insofar as such a regime has never existed. Exactly. In contrast, welfare state practices are deep parts of the political culture, nation-building efforts, and socioeconomic circumstances of many democratic societies. So with that modification in place, I move on to the core in Edmondson's political case for liberal socialism. Following that, I argue that the guidelines provided by justice as fairness do not decisively weigh against a modified idea of the welfare state and a necessary favor of liberal socialism. I don't, however, make the stronger claim, the opposite claim to Edmondson's, that only welfare state capitalism can realize justice as fairness. I just try to show that some of the grounds Edmondson offers in exclusive favor of Rawlsian socialism are not as firm as suggested. So section, I guess that was section 1, that was the introduction. Section 2, bringing the welfare state back in is what I've called section 2 here. Okay. So Rawls's ruling out of the welfare state as compatible with his principles of justice, as I mentioned, occurs rather quickly, but is based on 3 supposed shortcomings of it as an ideal regime type. First is that the kinds of relations it creates amongst members of a political society, quote, fail to express reciprocity between citizens as free equals. Second, the welfare state cannot secure the principle of fair equality of opportunity, nor is it, quote, even serious about that goal. And third, the welfare state, according to Rawls, quote, does not even try to guarantee the fair value of political liberties. And as I'll show in a subsequent section, it's the failure to secure the fair value of political liberties that motivates what Rawls and Edmondson both consider a tendency towards injustice within welfare states. In this section, I focus on the first two grounds for rejecting the welfare state, that is the reciprocity and opportunity arguments. And in the subsequent sections, I move on to what is kind of the core of Edmonson's political case, its failure to secure the fair value of political liberties. Okay, bringing the welfare state back in. The dismissal of the welfare state can, I think, be attributed to a rather stunted ideal model Rawls gives. He conceives of the modest egalitarian thrust of the welfare state as securing a social minimum for those who can't secure sufficient resources through market participation, quote, at the end of each period, so to speak, when those who need assistance can be identified. So it's a residual mechanism in this case. So the primary aim of the welfare state, on Rawls's view, is to prevent persons from falling, quote, below a decent minimum standard of life by making sure basic needs are met and providing protection against accident and misfortune. What is notably left out of this model are opportunity-oriented interventions that occur before, quote unquote, each period to equalize chances of securing welfare state through subsequent participation in markets. Also missing, I argue, is an adequate conception of the social insurance elements of welfare state practice that function as freestanding source of cooperative benefits rather than just merely moving around those produced by markets. And such benefit conferral, I argue, embodies a robust conception of reciprocity between citizens engaged in mutual social insurance practices. So, as an ideal model of the welfare state, Rawls's conception falls well short of capturing much of the institutional practice that characterizes the wider world of welfare state democracy. By way of rehabilitation, the end of each period conception of the relationship of the welfare state to the market suffers from what Joe Heath in the back there, famously, I think, calls the catalectic bias in theorizing the nature and scope of cooperative institutions. Under this bias, the market is theorized as the primary source of cooperative benefits, with the welfare state coming in later as a remedial measure to redistribute some of those benefits to avoid situations in which those who can't secure adequate welfare through market participation fall into conditions of deprivation or disadvantage. Again, as Joe Heath, in my view anyways, convincingly shows the welfare state should also be treated as a freestanding source of collective benefit rather than as a residual redistributive structure for otherwise produced resources. Social insurance schemes in particular are unique sources of collective benefit that are devised by groups facing uncertain risk. And moreover, in providing certainty, these operate at the beginning of, quote, each period by creating stable expectations throughout the life course and one's participation in institutions. Because of the profound uncertainty surrounding socioeconomic risk over the life course, risk pooling insurance schemes are mutually advantageous sources of collective benefit and move the rationale of major structures of social policy away from back-end remedial redistribution to front-end cooperative production of collective benefit in cases of market failure to provide such benefits. Now, of course, insurance and risk pooling arrangements can take many forms, most of which will fall short of the egalitarian demands of Rawls's theory of justice. The most natural mode is to set them up amongst homogeneous groups of people with relatively similar risk profiles. And while reciprocity can function within this group over time, this still falls well short of Rawls's vision of society itself as a system of reciprocal cooperation. But what is of note here is that during the 20th century evolution of the welfare state, social insurance policies extended well beyond pure or their original insurential logic of common protections against homogeneous groups of people and sectoral interests, up to the level of universal citizenship right, which had the effect of including many differentiated social locations and risk profiles into the scope of common state protections. Social insurance also increasingly functioned as an egalitarian policy tool as its contributory financing became more and more progressive, depending on the governments of the day. So this kind of very short story of 20th century evolution of welfare state development touches on Rawls's concern of the welfare state failing to provide the institutional content of reciprocity between citizens as free and equal. With the advancement of universal social rights, advanced welfare state practices emerged as a primary site of reciprocal relations between citizens in welfare state democracies. As Esping Anderson famously argued in his famous book, 3 Worlds of Welfare State Capitalism, the welfare state is a generative mechanism and can order social relations in different ways that might be more or less conducive to grounding reciprocal support for common protections. Quoting Esping Anderson, the welfare state is not just a mechanism that intervenes in and possibly corrects the structure of inequality. It is, in its own right, a system of stratification. The welfare state is an active force in ordering social relations. The egalitarian key in this process is connecting the welfare state to the idea and character of citizenship itself. Whereas targeted programs function to prevent the generation of widespread social solidarity and in fact reinforced class-based interests against widespread reciprocity, universal programs, in contrast, have the effect of diminishing the salience of class interests and replacing them with a new shared set of politically defined experiences and expectations tied to the status of social citizenship. What the rights of social citizenship in effect accomplish is the creation of a new political status quo or baseline from which mutual interests and common protections can flow from increasingly homogenized risk pools delineated by the shared expectations and experiences of universal citizenship, guiding one's path through social and economic life. As the political scientist Janine Brody puts it, quote, social citizenship rights promise a new foundation for building social solidarity in advanced capitalist societies by engaging all citizens in a collective project that is grounded in state-based assurances of citizens' equality. In this sense, the welfare state itself can be viewed as an intervening variable that on the one hand reflects causal factors such as actions by coalitions and political interest groups, but on the other hand, potentially having feedback effects on distributive processes through the formation of interests, preference, and new coalitions among citizens. The last part of that is a quote from an article by Corpy and Palm. In so doing, social citizenship effectively brings the interests of the advantaged into alignment with the welfare state by crowding out class perspectives and experiences across a range of socioeconomic areas of life. As the 20th century theorist, sociologist of social citizenship, T.H. Marshall puts it, social citizenship works in this regard through the, quote, invasion of the contract by status and the replacement of the free bargain by a declaration of right. The development of social citizenship through the expansion of welfare state programs and entitlements creates a new political egalitarian baseline by leveling out exposure or vulnerability to socioeconomic risks and leveling out capacity to manage their actualized occurrences. And as mentioned, this can over time diminish the salience of interests rooted in class and heighten interests rooted in shared citizenship. With a robust conception of social citizenship in place, Marshall argues that subsequent equalization measures are experienced, quote, not so much between classes, but as between individuals within a population now treated for this purpose as though it were a single class. New interests rooted in the shared experiences and expectations of citizenship can lend solidaristic support to subsequent deepening of common protections. This is a distinct political logic generated by the state itself in framing policy in certain ways to instigate a two-way process between institutions and interests in which the welfare state is an active agent in organizing its grounds for support and stability, and by creating conditions for reciprocal performance amongst equally situated citizens upon the actualization of social and economic risk for some. In a recent book, Rachel Friedman, the book is titled Probable Justice, argues that social insurance is therefore a critical site of democratic interaction between citizens in an advanced welfare state. In practice, social insurance has and can function as a key point of democratic politics and debate, a place where, quote, communities debate their own sense of security and their financial commitment towards the future. That last bit includes a quote from Ronnie Hirsch, a recent article. So this discussion was meant to reveal the inadequacy of the ideal model of the welfare state that Rawls presents and quickly rejects as being consistent with justice as fairness. Unlike Rawls's end of each period residual image of the welfare state, much of welfare state practice is indeed oriented towards correcting market failure in collective benefit provision, and is therefore a freestanding source of many of the primary goods that function as the subject of Rawls's theory of justice and that constitute and structure the life chances of members in a political society. Okay, so that's a rehabilitation of the reciprocal dimensions of welfare state practice. I also make a claim in the paper, I won't dwell on it here, that a reconstructed view of the welfare state can also make significant inroads on the value of equalizing opportunity outside of insurance structures. I have in mind here opportunity and corrective-oriented social and economic policies, including publicly funded or subsidized education, public child care, anti-discrimination laws, affirmative action legislation, and a variety of mechanisms oriented towards providing something like a basic income. So this fuller, and in my view, better aligned with practice, brings the ideal regime type characterization of the welfare state closer to the normative structure of Rawls's largely speculative notion of property owning democracy, with, as mentioned, the added advantage of its existence. This is certainly the case in their respective institutional orientation towards the ideals of reciprocity and equality of opportunity, which, referring here to property owning democracy, quote, from the outset puts in the hands of citizens sufficient means for them to be fully cooperating members of society on equal footing. The welfare state is capable of providing, quote, the human capital, knowledge, and an understanding of institutions, educational abilities, and training skills that are required for opportunity to participate economically and politically in the life of a democratic state. So this all being said by way of rehabilitating the welfare state's connection to reciprocity and equal opportunity brings us up to Edmondson's political or democratic case for Rawlsian socialism and his argument against the viability of property owning democracy, and now more to the point, a reconstructed idea of something like a social democratic welfare state with the capacity to deliver justice as fairness in a sustained way over time. So what I haven't addressed so far is the third reason Rawls rules the welfare state out as compatible with his theory of justice, which is that the welfare state, quote, does not guarantee the fair value of political liberties that are needed as protective mechanisms to secure just social cooperation over time. So the point here, to kind of get into it, is that Edmondson and Rawls could accept that reconstructed view of the welfare state I just gave as a plausible interpretation of it as a socioeconomic, ideal socioeconomic regime, but nevertheless still argue and try to rule it out as consistent with justice as fairness by pointing out that its underlying property system, that is private ownership of productive property, will create political dynamics that over time will undercut the stability and scope of an egalitarian welfare state. So the idea here, even if in principle, this reconstructed idea of the welfare state can deliver the principles of justice, for Rawls and Edmondson, there's this third political dynamic that undercuts its viability. That is its inability to secure the fair value of political liberties, and kind of provide these democratic insulating or protective mechanisms along the way. So the political concern is at the core of Edmondson's view that justice is not realizable in a stable manner in the absence of socialistic structures of the public ownership of the means of production, even in an otherwise democratic and social democratic system that upholds basic liberties and equality of opportunity. With private ownership of the means of production and the concentration of the commanding heights of economic production in a few hands, the view here is that the welfare state capitalist societies are inherently vulnerable to what Edmondson calls political domination. Political domination erodes political equality and over time generates what Rawls calls the tendency towards injustice. Furthermore, Edmondson in his book contends that this fact of political sociology, what he calls the fact of domination, would or should be known to Rawlsian contractors, and so constitutional protections of the fair value of political liberties and rights would in fact be established in the original position, that's Rawls's idea of the social contract, by way of constitutional enshrining of public ownership of the means of production. This, Edmondson holds, should function much the same way as does one of the few bits of political sociology originally permitted in Rawls's theory of justice, that is the so-called fact of pluralism. So in a theory of justice, those in Rawls's hypothetical contract situation are aware of what Rawls calls the fact of pluralism. The political society is going to be defined by deep and irreconcilable ethical disagreement. And knowing this fact, they will set up constitutional protections of basic civil liberties in the case they might end up in one minority culture or another that is vulnerable to political domination by majority cultures. Further inclusion of the fact of domination in addition to the fact of pluralism as matters of political sociology permitted into Rawls's social contract would similarly lead to the constitutional protection of the fair value of political liberties beyond their formal establishment. Okay, I will explain all that now in more detail in section 3, titled The Supposed Imperative of Rawlsian Socialism, Fair Value of Political Liberty. As mentioned, following Rawls, Edmondson holds that welfare state capitalism, quote, tends inevitably towards injustice. This is because the kinds of socioeconomic inequalities it permits, even under that reconstructed view of it I just presented, undermines, quote, the fair value of political liberties and renders political relations over time as relations of domination rather than relations of equality, which in a kind of downward feedback loop will deepen inequality and domination over time. In the Restatement, that's Rawls's last book, he explicitly presents the fair value of political liberties as, quote, a prior and first principle of reciprocity between citizens as free equals. That is to say, fair value is included in the first principle of justice that includes the constitutionally secured civil and political liberties and is prior to principles of opportunity and the difference principle. The idea of fair value of liberty extends beyond merely formal political equality and, quote, ensures that citizens similarly gifted and motivated have roughly an equal chance of influencing the government's policy and of attaining positions of authority, irrespective of their economic and social classes. An interesting point of departure to note here between Rawls and Edmondson is that even though fair value is eventually included in the first constitutionally settled principles of justice, in his discussion of the politics of them, Rawls only identifies legislative measures that might secure fair value over time. Those include principles that regulate socioeconomic inequality and a range of policies meant to, quote, insulate politics from the inequalities permitted under the difference principle. Those include public funding for election campaigns, equal access to public media, so on and so forth. So a range of legislative mechanisms designed to maintain the fair value of political liberty. Edmondson, however, argues that Rawls's theory commits him to constitutional rather than legislative protection of the fair value of political freedom. The key idea here in reflecting on the tendencies of domination and inequality as simple, quote, facts of political power as such is that structural protections for political interests are to be taken off the democratic agenda. Quoting Edmondson here, insofar as fair value is a constitutional essential, the Constitution itself ought to secure it as far as is possible. So apart from and prior to the threat of wealth inequality to political equality are the political challenges posed by private ownership of productive property and natural resources. Welfare state capitalism, including the reconstructed social democratic form I presented at the outset of the paper, by leaving productive property in private hands, as Rawls puts it, quote, permits very large inequalities in the ownership of real property, that is, productive assets and natural resources, so that the control of the economy and of much else in political life rests in but a few hands. And this narrow and exclusive control, he argues, can be reliably predicted to move society away from a cooperative system between persons with roughly equal capacity to influence the political system to a situation of political domination in which the value of some persons and groups' political rights and liberty far outweighs that of others. As Rawls puts it in the case of US welfare state capitalism, quote, with great wealth being in the control of corporate power, is it any wonder that legislation is, in effect, written by lobbyists, and that the legislature becomes a bargaining chamber in which laws are bought and sold? And notably for Edmondson, these laws that are being bought and sold would include the very legislative efforts Rawls proposes to safeguard the fair value of political liberty. Edmondson suggests these would be, quote, among the first items to be bought and sold unless there are prior constitutional constraints firmly in place. So, as mentioned, these apparent and alarmingly quite real threats posed by private control of productive assets onto the fair value of political liberties should therefore be known to Rawlsian contractors. And if known, much like in the case of the fact of pluralism and the generation of civil liberties, Edmondson argues that, quote, prudent parties wouldn't take the risk of trying to live under the principles of justice in a system that, quote, permits private property in productive assets. With this new freshly minted fact of domination in hand, Rawlsian contractors would view the settlement of public ownership of the means of production as, quote, a constitutional essential, and would not render it subject to revision by ordinary majoritarian legislation. Doing so, Edmondson argues, requires entrenching public ownership of the means of production and natural resources in the Constitution. And it is in this foundational and constitutional sense that Edmondson argues Rawlsian justice requires liberal socialism. Okay. That brings me to my last section. For better or worse, called Evaluating Regime Type Compatibility with Demands of Justice. Okay. All right. Get back to that one. Okay. Again, I will emphasize Edmondson's book, very much worth your time if you're doing these kind of work on the sort of interaction between normative theories of justice and sort of political economy. Lots of really interesting stuff in there. I'll just kind of scratch the surface and outline a critical assessment of two elements of Edmondson's political case for the requirement of Rawlsian socialism. The first argument concerns the complexity involved in including specific means to constitutional ends in the Constitution itself. And the second line of argument develops something of a dilemma in constitutionalizing productive ownership of, or public ownership of productive property for the purpose of stabilizing political equality over time. So first, I, for one, find the proposal of attaching specific means to constitutional ends, in this case, the fair value of political liberties, in the Constitution itself, to be a rather perplexing undertaking. I'm not sure how widespread this practice is. Perhaps it is widespread, and if it is, I'm not sure how effective it is. But anyways, struck me as a bit strange. The amount of speculative agreement required by Rawlsian contractors at the constitutional stage on basic facts of politics and law, I think, is likely to be too demanding and complicated to be settled constitutionally. These include questions of whether the inequality permitted on the difference principle necessarily results in political domination, and whether legislative measures to address this possibility are unattainable so long as productive property remains privately owned. But even if constitutionally including means to constitutional ends for fair value of political freedoms is agreed on at a general level, it is not clear that settling the property question by way of constitutional public ownership would be the way forward. It certainly might be a way forward in certain times and places, but not so decisively as to be settled once and for all constitutionally. Ultimately, Rawls's main worry is the effect of socioeconomic inequality on political equality. And private ownership of capital is subsumed under this broader concern. So Edmondson's primary concern is how an inegalitarian ordering of a society's class structure will cut off the legislative path to securing socioeconomic equality through, in my view, the welfare state, and securing fair value of political freedom. But it is not clear that socializing the so-called commanding heights gets us closer to the goal of guaranteeing a society free of the fact of political domination, rooted in the deeper issue of economic inequality, rather than the ownership of property per se. Socializing productive property as a means to preserving fair value of political liberties is therefore two steps removed from the goal of political non-domination or equality. Eliminating class-based inequality is the more proximate means that commonly owned capital is meant to secure by heading off the advantage's capacity to capture legislative processes. However, socializing the commanding heights of industry in an otherwise liberal market society does not free it from the conditioning forces entailed in efficient, productive operations that themselves will result in significant socioeconomic inequality. As G.A. Cohen discusses in his critique of market socialism, quote, the required disciplining role under market socialism, in contrast to free market welfare states, is assigned to banks and other financial institutions rather than to large shareholders of private firms. But in both cases, downward pressure can be expected on standard, that is, unskilled and semi-skilled employment levels and remuneration, coupled with upward pressure permitted by the difference principle in the case of more specialized labor. Incentive-based inequality is not likely to be significantly reduced in public corporations compared to private ones, and so class-based differentials are not necessarily abated in a system of public ownership in an otherwise market society, nor are there effects on politics. This is of concern as it is not altogether clear which is the more persistent and effective source of resistance to legislative efforts to create social policy that would move a democratic society closer to socioeconomic equality. Powerful actors under a regime of private ownership certainly capture and at times perhaps even dominate legislative processes that apply more or less directly to their operations. But these are largely regulatory matters that, while certainly important for their societal impacts, apply indirectly to the wider elements of the life chances of individuals central to Rawls's theory of justice. Indeed, over time and in different societies, the political behavior of private business appears to be agnostic to welfare state efforts. As Elizabeth Anderson, Sherry Berman, and others, students of the welfare state have argued, in many cases, large business is often supportive of the establishment of a variety of social insurance policies under welfare state capitalism. Electoral opposition to extending universal social policy, however, is frequently found in the case of advantaged citizens, where risk differentials and capacity for private mitigation of risk are apparent. Public ownership of the means of production does not necessarily affect this dynamic, as market socialism also faces downward disciplining and upward incentivizing forces on wages. And this leads to my second line of critique, and the last point I'll make here, is it is not clear that socializing a rather nostalgic notion of the commanding heights of a society's economy would be sufficient in scope to stamp out the politically distorting effects of economic inequality, and power more generally. Attempting to work public ownership into a stable constitutional framework faces something of a dilemma in satisfying the intended Rawlsian purpose of doing so, that is, maintaining political equality over time, and removing controversial issues from the democratic agenda. A traditional and narrow conception of the commanding heights, broadly endorsed by Edmondson, of, quote, banking, insurance, rail, mineral resources, and so forth, might have the capacity to achieve consensus, but comes with a considerable cost of leaving many large, consequential, service-oriented sectors outside of the definition of the commanding heights. As Edmondson puts it, big does not necessarily entail means of production. Big, though, does mean powerful and deeply structuring of unequal social and class relations. And moreover, big firms can also be sites of political domination themselves. Aiming for a more inclusive and adaptable conception of the means of production to cover a wider range of economic sectors, the emergence at least to me, over time is utterly unpredictable, would have the effect of undermining the thrust of constitutional protection in the first place. To recall, the point of constitutional settlement is to produce political stability by, quote, taking highly divisive, irresolvable issues off the political agenda. And again, the political agenda that is susceptible to elite capture. However, one might ask, does this work? Is this the end of divisive and irresolvable issues on the public agenda? One might ask, is Amazon part of the commanding heights of the Canadian economy? If so, when did this happen? Who gets to decide? The government of the day, the Supreme Court of Canada, so on and so forth. Would the notwithstanding clause apply in such a case? And if so, how long would it apply? Leaving aside the issue of whether and how a government like Canada's could possibly nationalize a global firm like Amazon, these become the very kinds of controversial and divisive legislative and legal issues that Edmondson argues would be captured by powerful interests, themselves now being considered for nationalization, that undercut fair value of political liberty in collective decision-making. So the dilemma faced here is that on the one hand, a conception of productive property that is fixed and narrowly tailored might achieve constitutional consensus, but will fail over time as a means to preserve political equality and the fair value of political rights. On the other hand, a more expansive, fluid conception will return us to the controversies and supposed limits of domination in the legislative path that motivated the constitutional concern in Edmondson's analysis in the first place. So, certainly much more to say, and as I mentioned, this just touches on many of the arguments in Edmondson's very rich and rewarding book. But for now, and in conclusion, I'll just state, I don't think that Edmondson successfully shows that justice's fairness decisively weighs in favor of liberal socialism and against a social democratic welfare state. Nothing about the latter precludes state-generated relations of reciprocity, legislative measures towards equalizing opportunities, or legislative efforts to securing the fair value of political freedoms themselves. These, much like the development of the welfare state itself, have and certainly will continue to face considerable resistance and require ongoing political solidarity. And Edmondson's constitutional socialism, I argued, doesn't decisively smooth the political path towards social justice. So thank you all for listening. Appreciate it.